This question is a response to the Anderson Forecast 321, where GDP growth rate of 3% last year, 2% this year, and 1% next year. So I heard that and I said, how confident are you in that 1%? How well can you really see 2 years ahead? And then I thought more about this enterprise and I realized that that's not the right metaphor. Because the better metaphor is, rather than thinking us as in a hike and looking into the future to see where we are, the better way of saying it is we're backing into the future and we're looking at the historical record to figure out whether there's a big chasm ahead of us in the future as we back into it. So that's a reference to the inherent uncertainty that comes with any forecast and reliance on the history. So I want to show you how we rely on the history to talk about what's behind us in the future. And here's an essential slide. If I had one slide to leave behind, it would be this one. This is the one that I would use for introducing a macroeconomic course in Anderson School or anywhere I was teaching it. It's an image of US real GDP. So the vertical axis is 5,000, 7,000, 10,000. That's $10 trillion. For real GDP, and that scale is logarithmic. So you can see that the distance between 1,000 and 2,000 is bigger than 2,000 to 3,000. It pinches the stuff up at the top. That creates straight lines out of constant rates of growth. So you can see episodes of constant rates of growth in this image. The red verticals are the recessions. But what I've done is I've drawn these corridors around the blue wiggly line, which is the actual GDP. Around them, I've drawn these narrow corridors within which GDP has grown with multiple episodes. So there was an episode in the 50s in which the GDP growth was 3%. It shifted into high gear in the 60s with the 4.8% growth. And then we had this very, very long period of time of approximately 3%. Not quite 9.8 meters per second squared, but it just seemed like a constant of nature. But then all of a sudden in that recession in 2010, we dipped down. There's no recovery. You see that? You didn't come back up again. You dipped down and you had a totally new growth. So that's the thing that we have to forecast, which is the recessions where you dip down into the bottom of the corridor and the recoveries when they come back, and the long-term economic growth. And I mentioned incidentally that 2% is inconsistent with the 1% forecast. To the extent that we're still in that 2% corridor, we should be saying 2% for 2 years rather than 1%, unless there's a sort of mixture of recession. So the tracks of the past is the growth rate is constant for long stretches of time. Another critical thing is that the changes in long-run growth rates seem to be concentrated, seem to coincide with recessions. So that makes it pretty critical that we know when the next recession is coming. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the rest of this talk. I'm giving myself these two tasks, which is build an alarm about a recession the next year and an alarm that indicates that there's a recession 2 years from now. A 1-year alarm and a 2-year alarm. And this is the way we're going to do this. We're going to look at an image like this. I'll put one bit of data in here. But the horizontal axis represents the quarters before and after the cycle peak. The dark vertical axis over in the middle here is where the cycle peak is. So these squiggles that I'm putting up here represent U.S. expansions. That latest one was the expansion that ended in 1953 Q2. And you can move over to the left side, you can see how much growth there was. A little more than 20% GDP growth occurred in that expansion. And you look down at the bottom, you can see how long it lasted, about 13, 14 quarters. And the cycle peak is at just like I've labeled it. I hope you all see this, because now we're going to fold in all these other expansions that we've had. And that's the Bush-Clinton expansion. And it was the oldest that we've ever had, 40 quarters in length. And that was the 2001 that ended 2007 Q4. And this is where we are now. And I put that image in here as if we were about ready to go in recession this next year. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at that last quarter of data and see if there's anything unusual in that last quarter compared with earlier in the expansion. something that would alert us to the oncoming recession. So I ask you, can you see what's called stall speed? There's a lot of discussion on Wall Street about the US economy going to stall speed, meaning that instead of growing at 3%, you're growing at 2% or 1%, and then you're going to, like an aircraft, crash. Well, I don't see stall speed in this image. I don't see anything, maybe you see something I don't see, but I don't see any kind of symptom of the oncoming recession in the GDP numbers. But what about 2 years ahead? So when we roll back for a 2-year horizon, we're going to focus on this darkened region, which is 2 years ahead, and try to figure out whether there's anything going on there that would tell us that there's an oncoming recession. And it's even worse 2 years ahead is what I would say. But there's something that is in that data set, which is that this expansion is quite old. We go back to the image we had before. Well, we won't do that. That was too hard. I've lost control. I've lost control. I want to go backwards. Oh, this is back? Yeah. Oh, okay. I flunked the IQ test up here. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm back to the elderly gentleman here, most appropriately. By the way, I'm very offended with this idea that growing older means you're getting closer to the end of life. You can say that about expansions, but please don't say that about me. We're going to deal with a predictive model that has used 3 variables. One is the age of the expansion, the quarters of length that it's existed. The secondly is the slope of the yield curve, which David already mentioned. And the third is building permits. These slope of the yield curve and building permits are 2 of the best indicators of an oncoming recession. So I've done a little cherry picking with regard to that. We're going to focus on those. So this is the slope of the yield curve, the 10-year rate minus the 3-year rate, illustrated in exactly the same kind of diagram that you saw for the GDP. That's why we looked at that one a little carefully. So you're supposed to be looking at this, the last year before the recession, which is this darkened region, and see if you can see anything that's different in that period than earlier in the expansion. And you sure as heck can, because you see the inverted yield curves in which the slope of the yield curve dips below 0. So that looks like a pretty good indicator. We'll do the econometrics to see how well that works, but it looks like it's going to work. And then what about the 2-year forecast? Well, that also has a slope of the yield curve which is not as tall as it is originally, but it's also suggested maybe that would be helpful as well for a 2-year forecast. Then the question is, why is that? There are 2 stories that would explain why the inverted yield curve would be a precursor to a recession. One is a predictive story. So inverted means that the short-term rate is higher than the long-term rate. Why would you buy a 10-year treasury when you can buy a 3-month with a higher yield? The answer is, if you knew the yield was only temporary, that 3-month rate is going to fall pretty soon, better to lock in a 10-year now while you can and benefit from that in the future. So this is a bond market prediction that interest rates are going to fall, which is what happens in recessions when the Fed cuts interest rates. So then there's also a causal story, which the banking sector makes money off of a steeply sloped yield curve because they take loans at short maturities, deposits at a certain rate, and they take deposits at short rates at low yields, and they make loans for longer maturities at high yields. And that spread is called intermediation spread. And it provides a banking profit for every loan that's created. But when that yield curve flattens out, there's no intermediation profit for the banking sector, and all of a sudden they have to really make sure the loans are going to be paid back. It becomes much more critical than when you have that steep yield curve. So that's a causal story. I really think we should measure the monetary authority, by the way, not by interest rates, but by the slope of the yield curve. And let's hope the Fed has the wisdom not to let that yield curve invert. They're getting it awfully flat, is what I would say already. This is the other variable we're going to work with. It's building permits. Over here on the left-hand side is 500,000, 1,500. This is thousands at an annual rate. So the building permit rate normal is about 1.5 million. And again, I ask you to look what's happening in the years before recessions that would give you a warning sign. And you're supposed to see that building permits are declining in that year, but also they're high and declining, it looks like. So you kind of think that's going to be an early warning sign. What if you go back to the year before? That doesn't seem, so you look at those data and you look at the earlier data, what's so unusual about them? It isn't so clear that building permits going to work to do a 2-year forecast. They look like they'll be pretty good for a 1-year forecast. So what I just described is what's going on when you do the econometric work. And I teach my students never to put up on a slide the econometric outcome, the estimates and the t-statistics and all that stuff, but I felt compelled to do it today. And the dependent variable is a binary variable indicating the periods of time that were the year before recessions. We're building a model that's trying to identify those. We're basically contrasting that last year with the years before. And the contrast is based, first of all, on a spread, and the statistical reliability of it is measured by the t-stat. That says the spread matters. Negative means a steep yield curve is good, making the recession probability small, but an inverted yield curve or a flat yield curve raises the risk of a recession coming forward. In terms of permits, both these signs are, the first sign is positive, the level of permits, but the rate of growth of permits is negative. So it says in the year before recessions, you have high but declining building permits. That would be a symptom of some concern going forward. But the expansion age doesn't matter. It's kind of like once you've been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, it doesn't matter how old you are, the end is near. And the life-threatening illness is an inverted yield curve in the case of an expansion. There's an old joke about how the expansions don't die, they're murdered by the Federal Reserve. And they're the ones who create that inverted yield curve. So here's the image, the forecast that result. The red lines are the verticals are the recessions. The black lines are the predicted probabilities that a recession is within 2 years, and within 1 year. And I said there are a couple false positives. A perfect forecast model would have 100% in the year before. Those black lines would go all the way up to 100%, and then zeros otherwise. And you can see this doesn't do so good. You got the false positives; those are too big, and you very rarely get up near 100%. But the telling thing is there's only a 17% risk of a recession for this next year. The yield curve isn't sufficiently negatively sloped, and the building permits are definitely not organized to make the risk of recession next year very high at all. So that's a critical point. And that's kind of consistent with the 2 that the Anderson forecast has offered. That's the normal 2 for this next year. So let's think about the year after. In the year after, it's true that the spread matters. This is for the 2-year prediction. And permits now are both coefficients are positive. So the 2-year ahead forecast is going to give you an elevated risk when permits are high and growing higher. In other words, you're building too many homes, basically. You're already building a lot, and you're even building more. That's creating the foundation for a recession 2 years from now. Not next year, but 2 years from now. And then in the age, this is where the age really matters, where it didn't enter into the 1-year prediction, it enters into the 2-year prediction. But this is the image that we looked at before for the 1-year prediction. This is 2-year prediction, and you can see the black line, which is the forecasted probabilities of recessions. That doesn't ever get up very high. You don't get up to 100%. So that's one way of saying you're not really seeing the 2 years ahead very well at all. About as high as you're ever going to get is to like a 35 or 40% chance of recession 2 years from now. I can tell you, I've never seen a professional forecast offer a recession forecast 2 years in advance. Never. And even 1 year is extraordinarily rare. Most forecasts are going to predict some economic growth even in the year ahead. But that's consistent with this. 2 years is very difficult to see. And what comes rolling out of this model is actually it's a 28%, pretty much an elevated risk of a recession in 2 years. Why is that? It's because of age, which is the last two slides I'm trying to get across. It's not the slope of the yield curve, it's not permits. If we're seeing what happens in 2 years, it's really age that matters, and only that matters. So this is the forecasted probabilities with and without the age effect. You can't see it so well, but the blue represents the model as is, and then the red line below that represents the model with that age effect removed, and they're almost identical. So it says just what I told you before, that predicting recessions for next year, all that talk on Wall Street about how old this thing, that's not relevant. Watch building permits and watch the slope of the yield curve if you want to know what's going to happen next year. Don't worry about the aging of this expansion. But this is a slide that is a 2-year forecast. So the blue image here represents the predicted probabilities if you include all the variables, and the red represents the predicted probabilities if you remove the aging effect. And that's very low. Right now it's almost 0.01% or something, a very small number. So it says, what I said before is that if you're thinking about what's happening in 2 years or even more 3 years, basically all you know is that this expansion is getting older, and most expansions don't last that long. But that's not a forecast that can be done with a whole lot of confidence. But to wrap up and to celebrate the aging of many of you in the audience, I hope that you could hear what I said. Thank you.